He didn't go to the gala to rescue anyone. He went because Crispin Hale owed him a number with too many zeros, and Severin Belandi collected in person. He expected a quiet signature, a threat folded inside a toast, and a car home by 11. Instead, across a ballroom drowning in champagne and rehearsed laughter, he watched a man humiliate a woman for the sin of taking up space, and something Severin had kept caged for 31 years slipped its leash. What he learned about her before the night ended didn't just ruin Crispin Hale. It burned down the life Severin had spent a decade building. The Ashford Foundation Gala was the kind of event where people wore their cruelty like cufflinks, small, polished, easy to miss unless the light caught it right. Severin Belandi stood at the edge of the marble ballroom, with a glass of untouched Barolo in his hand, watching 400 of the city's most important liars pretend to enjoy each other. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling, painted with fat, indifferent angels. A string quartet sawed politely through something Baroque. Waiters drifted between the tables like schooling fish, silver trays balanced on flat palms, and every man in the room was calculating the net worth of every other man in the room, while smiling as though they weren't. He hated the perfume layered over sweat, the laughter pitched too high, the way money made a sound when there was enough of it in one place, a low, humming pressure, like standing too close to a transformer. He had grown up with none of it and clawed his way into all of it, and the joke that nobody had told him was that the top of the mountain looked exactly like the bottom, only the knives were cleaner. "You're doing the thing again," said the woman beside him. Delphine Marbury wore ivory silk and diamonds that belonged in a vault, and she held herself with the effortless boredom of someone who had never once wondered where her next anything was coming from. She was by every metric the world respected, a perfect match for him. Her family controlled the freight terminals on the North River. His controlled everything that moved through them. Their fathers, hers by blood, his by the older, bloodier kind of allegiance, had been circling this arrangement for 2 years, and tonight was meant to be the soft public beginning of it. A photograph, a hand on a waist. A story the papers would write themselves. "What thing?" Severin said, not turning. "The thing where your eyes go flat, and everyone within 10 feet starts sweating." She sipped her champagne. "It's bad for business. People are supposed to like you tonight. People don't have to like me. They have to pay me." Delphine laughed low and practiced. It was a beautiful laugh. It meant nothing at all, and they both knew it, and that shared knowing was the closest thing to intimacy either of them expected from the marriage their families were assembling like a bridge across a river neither of them had chosen to cross. She didn't love him, he didn't love her. What they had was an understanding, clean, dry, and cold as a contract. And Severin had spent years telling himself that was better than the alternative. Love was a liability. Love was a loose thread that the right enemy could pull until you unraveled. He had built his entire life around having nothing anyone could take from him. He believed that completely, right up until 9:47 that evening. "There he is," Delphine murmured, tilting her head. "Your favorite person!" Crispin Hale came through the crowd the way a coin rolls across a table. Flashing, self-satisfied, certain of where it would land. He was handsome in the expensive way. The kind of face that had never been told no, and had the smoothness to prove it. His tuxedo fit like it had been sewn onto him. His teeth were architecture. He shook hands as he crossed the room, gripping elbows, leaning in to say things that made older men bark with laughter. And every gesture was a small advertisement for how thoroughly Crispin Hale believed the world had been built for his convenience. He had the particular hunger of a man who always needed to be winning against someone. Severin knew better. He knew what most of the room didn't, that the Hale fortune was a corpse wearing cologne. 3 failed developments, a shipping venture that had taken on water in every sense, and a private loan, arranged through a man who worked for a man who worked for Severin, that had been quietly rolled over 4 times because Crispin could not cover it. He owed Severin $11 million. He owed it in 9 days. And tonight, at this gala, in front of everyone he was trying to impress, Severin intended to remind him of that with 2 sentences and a smile. Because that was how you collected from a man like Crispin Hale. Not with a threat, but with the memory of one, delivered somewhere he couldn't afford to flinch. Belandi. Crispin arrived with his hand already extended and a grin that didn't reach anything behind it. You actually came. I thought galas were beneath you. Everything's beneath me, Crispin, Severin said. That's rather the point of being up here. Crispin laughed too loudly. His eyes did a quick involuntary flick, down to Severin's untouched wine, over to Delphine, back up. The arithmetic of a man trying to figure out how much trouble he was in and hide the fact that he was doing the math. We should talk, he said later. Business? We should, Severin agreed pleasantly. 9 days, something in Crispin's face tightened, just for a heartbeat, before the grin sealed back over it, like water over a dropped stone. Plenty of time, he said, and clapped Severin on the shoulder. A liberty. Severin allowed the way one allows a child to touch something breakable, watching, ready. Then Crispin turned, scanning the room for softer company, someone he could win against, because that was the only shape victory ever took for him. Renzo appeared at Severin's other side, silent as weather. He was broad and unhurried, with a boxer's ruined knuckles and the calm of a man who had stopped being afraid of most things a long time ago. He said nothing about Crispin. He never wasted words on people who didn't matter yet. Instead, he leaned in half an inch and murmured, 2 of the Marbury men are outside. Everything's quiet. You want to be gone by 11? We leave through the East Service Hall. Severin nodded. 11. A signature, a reminder, a photograph with Delphine, and out. That was the plan. It was a good plan. It was the last plan Severin Belandi would make as the man he currently was, and he didn't feel it coming at all. Not the turn, not the ruin, not the small brown-haired woman near the service doors who was about to walk into the center of his ordered armored life and detonate it without ever raising her voice. He only felt the room change, a ripple near the far tables, laughter, but the wrong kind, the ugly kind, the kind that has a target. Severin turned toward it. She had been in the room for 2 hours, and Severin was fairly certain he was the only person who had noticed her before the trouble started. Not because she was beautiful in the way the room measured beauty. Delphine was that, and so were 40 other women drifting through the crowd. Like expensive smoke, he noticed the woman near the service doors for the opposite reason. In a ballroom engineered to make everyone perform, she was the only person not performing. She simply was, quietly and completely, and, to a man who had spent his whole life reading rooms for the one thing that didn't fit, she stood out like a struck match. She was a cellist, part of the quartet, though she'd stepped away during the break, and she stood now near the wall, with a plate she clearly hadn't intended to fill more than once, eating a single canapé with the unhurried focus of someone who had learned not to waste food. She was soft, with a room prized, sharp, full-figured, wide through the hips, a body that took up honest space in a green dress that Severin could tell, from the careful way it had been altered, was the nicest thing she owned and had been made to last several seasons past its fashion. Her dark hair was pinned up off a round, open face. There was a warmth to her that the room did not know what to do with, and so the room had done what rooms like this always did with warmth. It had decided not to see her. But Severin saw her, and because seeing was the skill that had kept him alive, he saw the other things too. He saw the way she'd positioned herself with her back to a load-bearing column and a clear line to 2 exits, the unconscious geometry of someone who had, at some point, needed to know how to leave a room fast. He saw the faint silver seam of an old scar along the edge of her left hand, the kind you got from something sharp, not something clumsy. He saw how her eyes moved, not the darting anxiety of a woman who felt out of place, but a slow, cataloging sweep, landing on faces, holding a half-second too long, moving on. She was reading the room the same way he was. She just didn't want anyone to know she could. Most of all, he saw her hands. When she'd played an hour earlier, Severin had drifted close enough to watch them, and there had been something in them that stopped him. Not just skill, though the skill was real. Grief. She played the low, aching passages like a woman paying off a debt to someone who was no longer alive to collect it, and Severin, who did not believe in much, had stood at the edge of the dance floor and felt the hair rise on his arms and been angry about it because he did not like feeling things he had not scheduled. He'd asked Renzo, idly, who she was. Nobody, Renzo had said, checking his phone. Hired music. Merrick, I think. Sorrel Merrick. Fills in with the quartet. A pause. Why? He'd told himself it was nothing. A trained eye snagging on an anomaly. He looked away. He knew almost none of the rest yet. Not that Sorrel Merrick took every underpaid gig she was offered and turned down. None. Not that she hadn't bought herself anything new in 3 years. Not the small apartment with the peeling radiator where a 9-year-old boy waited up past his bedtime. He didn't know about the hospital bills folded into a drawer, or the name she used to have, or why a woman who moved, like she'd been trained to survive, was playing cello for tips at a party full of people who wouldn't remember her face. He didn't know that in 10 minutes he would kill for her, and in 10 days he would rebuild his entire life around her, and that the cold, careful architecture of who he was had already begun to crack. He just hadn't heard the sound yet. All he knew in that moment was that the warmth in the corner of the room had gone very still, because Crispin Hale had found her. Severin watched him drift toward the service doors with a fresh drink and that grin, and he watched Sorrel Merrick set down her plate and lower her eyes and try, in the way women learn to try, to make herself smaller, to become furniture, to not be worth the trouble. It wouldn't work. Severin knew the look on Crispin's face. He'd worn it himself a lifetime ago, before he'd learned that the people you humiliate to feel large are the ones who eventually bury you. Crispin opened his mouth, and Severin Belandi, who had come here for $11 million and a photograph, set down his wine and started walking. Severin was 20 feet away when Crispin Hale opened his mouth, and close enough to hear all of it. Now here's a woman who enjoys herself, Crispin announced. He said it loudly, pitched over his shoulder to the cluster of people he'd left behind, folding them into the joke before the joke had even landed. The rest of you, picking at your plates like sparrows. This one knows the caterers spent good money. He let his eyes travel over her, slow and deliberate and unkind, inviting the crowd to do the same. Go on, don't let me stop you. God knows nothing else does. A few people laughed. Not because it was funny, because Crispin was rich and cruel, and it was safer to laugh with him than to be the next thing he pointed at. Severin had watched that particular arithmetic play out in rooms his entire life. It was the oldest currency there was. You bought your own safety by spending someone else's dignity. Sorrel didn't laugh. She didn't flinch either, and Severin, still walking, closing the distance without hurry, noted the difference. A woman who'd never been hurt flinched. A woman who'd been hurt too many times went still, the way small animals go still. The stillness that is not calm but calculation. She set her plate down on the service ledge behind her, unhurried, and lifted her eyes to Crispin's face, and said nothing at all. The nothing seemed to enrage him. Men like Crispin needed the reaction. The humiliation only worked if the target performed their own shrinking. Her silence robbed him of it, and so he reached for something bigger. What are you even doing here? He went on, warming to it, playing to the crowd. The help usually stays behind the curtain. Nobody sent you an invitation, sweetheart. You don't exactly blend in with the guest list. He laughed at his own line before he finished it. Somebody find her a chair, somewhere out of the way. Now more people laughed, and something happened in Sorrel Merrick's face that Severin would think about for a long time afterward. It wasn't hurt he'd expected. It was worse than hurt. It was recognition. the specific, bone-deep weariness of a person for whom this was not an event but a weather pattern. She had been here before, she would be here again. She had a whole architecture inside her, built for absorbing exactly this. And Severin could see her step into it now, like stepping into an old coat, squaring her shoulders to take the weight, and wait for it to pass. "I'm sorry, my being here bothers you," she said. Her voice was low and even and did not shake, and it carried further than Crispin's had, because the room had gone quiet to listen. "I'll stay out of your way." "You couldn't stay out of anyone's way," Crispin said, delighted. "Someone your size, in a room like this." He didn't finish. Because Severin Belandi's hand had closed around his wrist, the one holding the glass. And Severin was not squeezing. Not yet, just holding. The way you hold a door that you have decided is not going to open. To the room it looked almost friendly. Two men, close, one hand on another's arm. But Crispin's face had gone white, because Crispin could feel what the room couldn't. That the hand around his wrist was made of something that did not care how the moment looked, and that if it decided to close, the bones inside would simply stop being bones. "Blondie," Crispin said. He tried for a laugh. It came out as air. "Crispin." Severin's voice was pleasant, conversational. It was, in fact, the most dangerous thing anyone in that ballroom had heard all night, and only 3 people present were experienced enough to know it. Renzo, drifting silently into position by the doors. Delphine, watching from across the room with her champagne frozen halfway to her lips. And Sorrel Merrick, who had gone very still again. But a different kind of still, now watching Severin, the way you watch a storm change direction and start coming toward your house. "You're going to apologize to this woman," Severin said. "And then you're going to leave. And on your way out, you're going to think very carefully about the fact that you owe me $11 million, and about how few days you have left to find it, and about the specific ways in which I decide to be patient with people. Because I decide. Crispin, I decide who gets time. You want to be someone I'm generous with." He tilted his head the smallest fraction, and let the pleasantness drop off his voice like a sheet pulled off a body. "You are doing a remarkable job of the opposite." The silence in the ballroom had become total. Even the quartet had stopped. Crispin's mouth worked. He looked at Sorrel, and for 1 second, Severin thought he might actually do it. That some survival instinct might override the poison in him and make him say the words. But Crispin Hale had never in his life apologized to someone he decided was beneath him, and the muscle it would have taken simply wasn't there. Instead, his fear curdled, the way fear does in small men, into spite. "You're going to threaten me," Crispin hissed. Low, now, just for Severin. "Over some hired musician? Do you know who my—" Severin closed his hand. He did it almost gently. But the glass in Crispin's fingers cracked. A single clean sound in the silent room, and Crispin made a noise like a kettle and went to his knees on the marble, and Severin bent with him, unhurried, keeping the grip, keeping his own face calm and close, and said something into Crispin's ear that no one else could hear. Whatever it was, Crispin Hale stopped making noise. He went the color of the marble he was kneeling on, and when Severin let go and straightened his cuffs and stepped back, Crispin did not get up right away. He knelt there, cradling his hand, staring at the floor, ruined in front of every single person whose good opinion he had spent his whole life buying. Severin turned to Sorrel Merrick. The whole room was watching now, and he did not care. And that not caring was itself a kind of announcement to everyone who knew him, because Severin Belandi never gave a room anything to remember him by. "Are you all right?" he said. Not a question, quite, softer than anything he'd said all night. And Sorrel looked up at him. This stranger, this dangerous man, who had appeared out of nowhere and broken glass in a rich man's hand for her, and instead of gratitude, instead of fear, she said the last thing he expected. "You shouldn't have done that," she said quietly. "You have no idea what you just started." Severin had heard a great many things in his life. Threats, pleas, confessions, the specific silences that came before betrayals. He had not, in a very long time, heard something that stopped him the way those 8 words did. You have no idea what you just started. Not, thank you. Not, who are you? A warning. Delivered by a woman in an altered green dress, who 10 seconds ago had been the least powerful person in the room, and who had just spoken to him, like someone assessing damage, like someone who understood consequences on a scale the crowd around them couldn't see. Sorrel, Renzo said quietly, appearing at Severin's shoulder. He'd retrieved her name from somewhere. We should move. People are filming. They were. Phones had come up around the edges of the ballroom, and Severin registered the problem, with one cold, clear part of his mind, even as the rest of him refused to look away from her face. This was already a mistake. He operated in shadow. His entire architecture depended on never being the story. And here he was, the story in high definition, from 4 different angles, because a man had insulted a cellist, and something in Severin had come off its hinges. He should have felt the ice come back, the calculation. Instead, he heard himself say, "Get your coat." Sorrel's eyes narrowed. "I don't. You said I started something." Severin kept his voice level, low, and the sound that made men obey without knowing why. So finish the sentence. But not here, and not in front of 40 cameras. My car's outside. He paused, and then, because he could see her deciding whether to bolt, could see the exits she'd already mapped, he did something he never did. He softened it. You don't owe me anything, but you're frightened, and you're right to be, and I can put you somewhere frightened people can't follow. That's all I'm offering. For a long moment, she didn't move. Around them, the gala was reassembling itself, the quartet starting up again too brightly, and 400 people pretending very hard that they hadn't just watched a Hale go to his knees. Crispin had been helped up and away by someone. Delphine was cutting through the crowd toward Severin, with a look on her face like a gathering front. And Sorrel Merrick looked at the exits one more time, and then looked back at Severin, and Severin understood that she was not choosing him. She was choosing the least dangerous of several bad options, and she had just decided he was it, and somehow that landed harder than gratitude would have. My cello, she said. I'm not leaving without my cello. It's the only thing I have that's worth anything. Renzo. On it, Renzo said, and was gone. Delphine reached them first. Severin. She said his name like a leash. A word. Now, not now. You broke Crispin Hale's hand in front of the entire board of the Ashford Foundation. Her voice was silk, stretched over steel. Do you understand what you've done? My father is here. The photographs were supposed to be. She stopped, and her eyes moved to Sorrel, and did a slow, cold, dismissive inventory that Severin had seen 100 rooms perform tonight, and had somehow only just now started to hate. For this? You've thrown 2 years of arrangement away for the musician. Careful, Severin said. The word came out so quietly that Delphine actually stopped talking. She looked at him, really looked the way she rarely bothered to. And whatever she saw made her draw back half a step. Because Severin Belandi had never once, in the entire 2 years of their careful, transactional, almost marriage, told her to be careful about anything. He'd never cared enough to. We'll talk tomorrow, he said. The arrangement is he caught himself before he said dead, because some cold governor in him knew that was a decision he hadn't formally made yet, even if his hands had already made it on the marble floor. The arrangement can wait. Delphine's beautiful face closed like a door. No, she said, I don't think it can. And she turned and walked away, and Severin knew, with the part of him that never stopped calculating, that he had just made an enemy of the North River freight terminals, and everyone the Marburys answered to, and that the cost of the next hour was going to be measured in something much larger than $11 million. He found he didn't care. That more than anything frightened him. Renzo returned with the cello case slung across his back like a rifle. Sorrel took it from him with both arms, cradling it, and something in the way she held it, like it was a person, like it was the last person, told Severin more about her than an hour of questions would have. East Service Hall, Renzo said. Cars waiting. We're clear for 90 seconds. Then the valet line jams. Severin put his hand at the small of Sorrel's back. Not gripping, just there, just steering, and felt her go rigid at the touch, and eased off at once. This way, he said. They moved through the service door, as the ballroom swallowed the moment behind them, and out into a concrete corridor that smelled of bleach and kitchen steam. And Sorrel walked fast. Her cello clutched to her chest and she said without looking at him, "His father isn't the problem. Crispin's father is nothing. You need to understand that before we get in that car." She stopped at the door to the loading dock, one hand flat against it, and turned to face him at last, and her eyes were not the eyes of a frightened cellist anymore. They were steady, and grim, and frighteningly informed. "The man Crispin answers to the one he was really trying to impress tonight. You just humiliated his investment in front of the entire city." She pushed the door open, onto the wet dark. "And I know exactly who he is. Because 11 years ago, he's the reason I had to disappear. The car was warm, and dark, and smelled of leather, and rain-damp wool, and for the first mile, nobody spoke." Severin sat across from her watching. Renzo drove. The city slid past the tinted glass in long smears of light, and Sorrel Merrick sat very upright with the cello case standing between her knees, both hands wrapped around its neck, and she looked out the window like a woman memorizing a place she might not see again. He let the silence run. It was a tool. He understood better than most people. Filled silence with the truth, if you gave them enough of it and didn't grab. But Sorrel didn't fill it. She could outweight him, and after 4 minutes, Severin realized that too was information. That whatever she'd meant by disappear, it had taught her the same patience it had taught him. "You said 11 years," he finally said. "You said, he's the reason you disappeared." "He is." She turned from the window. In the passing light, her face was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "I'm going to tell you some of it, because you've made yourself a target on my behalf, and you deserve to know what you stepped in front of. But I'm not going to tell you all of it, because the parts I keep are the only reason I'm still breathing, and I've kept them this long by not handing them to strangers with expensive cars." "There," Severin said. She studied him at that, as if fair was not a word she'd expected from him. Then she nodded, once, and began. "His name is Ambrose Vane." She said it the way you'd name an illness. "You'll know the legitimate half, the foundations, the shipping insurance, the wing of the children's hospital with his name over the door. The other half you might not, because he's very good at the other half. Crispin Hale is a Vane investment, a face. Ambrose puts money behind pretty, hollow men and uses them to move things through doors that would stay shut to him. Tonight, you didn't humiliate a broke playboy in front of some board members. You humiliated Ambrose Vane's property. In front of everyone Ambrose is trying to look respectable for." She let that sit. "He will not let that stand. That's not a threat, it's just weather. I've watched it my whole adult life." Severin absorbed this without expression, though a great many things were rearranging themselves behind his eyes. He knew the name Ambrose Vane. Everyone at the top did. He had never done business with the man, and had gone to some quiet trouble to keep it that way, because Vane had a reputation, even among people, who did what Severin did, as someone who broke his toys and salted the ground. If Crispin was a Vane asset, then the $11 million debt had never really been Crispin's at all. It had been a leash, held from a distance, and Severin had just yanked the other end of it in a room full of witnesses. "And you?" he said. "How does a cellist know the private half of Ambrose Vane?" Sorrel was quiet for a moment. Her thumb moved along a worn place on the neck of the cello case, an old habit. "I wasn't always a cellist," she said. I am. It's the only thing that was ever really mine. But 11 years ago, I had a different name and a job I was very good at, and it put me close to people like Vane. Closer than close. I saw things, I wrote things down, because that was my job. I was the one who kept it all straight, who knew where everything was, and everyone was, and what it all cost. A thin, humorless smile. Men like Vane never see the person holding the records. We're furniture. We're the help. You noticed that yourself tonight, didn't you, when Crispin looked at me? Nobody watches the quiet one in the corner. It's the safest place in the world to stand, right up until it isn't. What happened? I saw something I couldn't unsee, and I made a choice most people in my position don't survive making. Her jaw tightened. I took what I knew and I ran. I burned my name to the ground. I've been small and poor and forgettable for 11 years on purpose, Mr. Belandi, because small and poor and forgettable is the only thing Ambrose Vane's people. A dead woman who plays cello for tips isn't worth the airfare. She looked at him levelly. And then tonight, a man I've never met broke a glass in Crispin Hale's hand over me in front of 400 people and a dozen cameras. So you'll forgive me if my first words to you weren't, "Thank you, you didn't rescue me tonight, you just told the one man. I've spent 11 years hiding from exactly where to find me." The car went quiet again. Severin looked at her, at the altered dress, the cheap, careful pins in her hair, the way she held the one beautiful thing she owned like a shield, and he understood, finally, what had snagged him across the ballroom. He didn't have much of that, and never had. It was recognition. He had spent his own life making himself into something that couldn't be taken from building walls out of money and fear, and here was a woman who had done the opposite, who had survived by making herself into nothing, by choosing to be unseen. And both of them, he realized, had ended up in the exact same prison, just entered through different doors. "There's a boy," he said. It wasn't a guess. Renzo had murmured it to him at the loading dock, one line pulled from somewhere in the 90 seconds they'd had. "She's got a kid at home, no father on record. You didn't run just for yourself." Sorrel's whole body changed. The composure she'd worn like armor all night cracked straight down the middle, and for one unguarded second, Severin saw the thing underneath it. Not a survivor, not a witness, but a woman, with something to lose, which is the most dangerous and most human thing a person can be. "Don't," she said, very quietly. "Whatever you're about to become to me, don't. If you're going to bring him into it, he's the one thing Vane doesn't know exists. He's 9 years old and he's asleep in a fourth-floor apartment right now with a broken radiator. And he is the only reason I didn't put those records into the world 11 years ago and let it burn everything down." Her voice did not rise, but it shook, and the shaking was worse than any shout. "You want to know what I keep? What I don't hand to strangers? That's it. That's the thing. His name, where he sleeps. He is the whole reason I'm still furniture." And Severin Belandi, who had built an entire life around having nothing anyone could take from him, who had told himself for a decade that love was a loose thread an enemy could pull, sat in the dark of the car and felt the last cold, careful wall inside him develop a crack he could hear. Because he wanted, suddenly and completely, to become the thing that stood between this woman's child and Ambrose Vane. And wanting it terrified him more than any enemy ever had. Up front, Renzo's phone lit the cabin. He glanced at it, and his shoulders changed, and he met Severin's eyes in the rearview mirror. "Boss," he said, "there's a car behind us. Been behind us since the gala. A beat? And the apartment on the fourth floor, the one with the radiator." He didn't finish gently, because Renzo never wasted words softening things. "Somebody just called it in to Vane's people 6 minutes ago. They have the address." Sorrel made a sound Severin would hear in his sleep for the rest of his life. "Drive," Severin said. "Not to the apartment, the other place on it," Renzo said, and the car surged, and the city rearranged itself around them into a getaway. Sorrel had her hand on the door handle, not to open it, to hold on to something, and her knuckles were white, and she was breathing in the fast, shallow way of a person, trying not to come apart, in front of a stranger. "The boy," she said. "Milo. His name is Milo. I have to. You have to do exactly nothing for the next 90 seconds while I get people moving," Severin said, and pulled out his phone, and the calm in his voice was not the calm of a man who didn't care. It was the calm of a man who had done this before and was very, very good at it. "Renzo. Who's closest to the fourth-floor address?" "Thomas and the Greco brothers. 15 minutes out if they run lights." They run lights. Severin was already dialing. "Milo," he said to Sorrel, without looking up. 9 years old. What does he do when a stranger knocks? He doesn't answer. He hides. "There's a crawlspace behind the closet I showed him. We practiced." Her voice caught on, practiced, on the fact that she had drilled a 9-year-old, on how to disappear, because she had known, always, that this night would come. "He won't open the door. But if they break it, they won't get the chance." Severin's call connected. He spoke fast and low. 3 sentences, an address, a description of a boy. The word alive, used the way another man might say, "Please." Then he hung up and looked at her. "My people will be inside that apartment before Vanes are off the highway. Milo hides. My people get him out the back. He's frightened for 20 minutes, and then he's safe, and you can be angry at me for the rest of it. But right now I need you to breathe, because I cannot fix a thing that hasn't happened yet, and I need you thinking." And Sorrel Merrick, to her enormous credit, and to Severin's lasting respect, breathed. She closed her eyes, and her shoulders dropped an inch, and when she opened them again, the frightened mother had folded herself back down under the survivor, and the survivor looked at Severin and said, "You want to know what I know. That's why you're helping. You think I'm useful." "I think you're in danger," Severin said. "But, yes, you're also useful. I'm not going to insult you by pretending otherwise. You've spent 11 years being underestimated. I'd rather be the one man who doesn't." Something moved behind her eyes. Surprise, maybe, that he'd said the true thing instead of the flattering one. She nodded slowly. "Then here's what you stepped into," she said. "And you're going to wish you'd stayed home," she told him. 11 years ago, she had not been Sorrel Merrick. She'd been a bookkeeper, the real kind, the invisible kind, the person who reconciled the numbers that men like Ambrose Vane could never afford to write down themselves. She'd worked out of a shipping office that laundered more than freight, and she'd been good and quiet and trusted, because trusted was what you called the help when the help could count. For 4 years, she'd kept 2 sets of books, the one the world saw and the real one, the one that tracked where the bodies were buried, financially and, twice, literally, she hadn't planned to keep the real one. But she'd learned young that the only insurance a nobody ever gets is knowing where the powerful hid their sins, and so she'd copied everything, quietly, for 4 years, into a ledger only she could read. And then one night she'd reconcile the number that didn't reconcile, and followed it and found out what Ambrose Vane did to the people who became inconvenient, and found out that a man she'd worked beside for 2 years, a man with a family, had become inconvenient the week before and was now a rounding error she was being asked to smooth over. "I could have smoothed it," she said. Her voice was flat, scoured clean of everything but fact. "That was my job. Make the number make sense. I'd done worse and told myself it wasn't me doing it, but I was pregnant." She said it plainly, this time. No cover, no correction. The truth handed over at last, and the handing over cost her something visible. "I'd told everyone at the office it was my sister's. Easier. Safer. A woman with a child is a woman with a weakness. And I'd learned never to show Vane a weakness. But he was mine. And I looked at that number, at what it meant, and I thought about bringing my son into a world where I was the woman who made that number make sense, and I couldn't. So you took the ledger and ran." "I took the ledger and ran." She almost smiled. "I made copies. I put them somewhere Vane can't reach and can't destroy, with instructions. If I die, if I disappear, if I go quiet for more than a set number of days. Federal, foreign, and 2 newspapers who hate him. I can also throw the switch myself, on command, from anywhere, if it ever comes to that. That's my insurance. That's why I'm alive. Ambrose Vane has spent 11 years knowing that somewhere out in the world is a dead woman who can bury him, and not being able to find her because she made herself too small to chase. She spread her hands. It worked. For 11 years it worked. I played cello. I raised my boy as my sister's. Kept the story even from him, God help me, because a secret a child doesn't know is a secret a child can't accidentally tell. Milo doesn't exist on any record Vane can pull, and every single day I stayed small was a day he stayed safe. And tonight, Severin said quietly, I made you visible. You made me visible. No accusation in it now, just exhaustion. The cameras. Your name. By tomorrow morning, there'll be footage of Ambrose Vane's investment getting broken in half by Severin Belandi over some cellist, and Vane's people will do what they do, which is find out who the cellist is. And the second they pull the thread, the second anyone runs my face, it starts to unravel. The name, the old name, 11 years ago. And then he'll know his dead woman isn't dead. She looked at him. You didn't defend me tonight, mister. Belandi. You woke him up. The car was silent except for the tires on wet road. Renzo's eyes flicked to the mirror. The tail car had dropped back, but it was still there, a patient pair of headlights, 3 cars deep. Severin sat very still and understood. All at once, several things. He understood that he had not stumbled into a story about a bullied cellist. He had walked into the 11-year Cold War between Ambrose Vane and the one person alive who could end him, and he had, in one unguarded moment on a marble floor, kicked the board over. He understood that Sorrel Merrick was not a woman he needed to protect so much as a weapon of extraordinary power who had chosen, for a decade, not to fire, out of love for a child. And he understood, with a clarity that made his chest hurt, that he had been given a choice most men in his position never got. He could walk away, hand her enough money to vanish again, and let her go back to being invisible. Or he could pick up the other end of the leash he'd already grabbed and use everything he was, every gun, every dollar, every frightening thing he'd built, to make sure Ambrose Vane never touched her or the boy again. The old Severin would have paid her to disappear. The old Severin had spent a lifetime learning that the only safe thing to love was nothing. His phone buzzed. He looked at it, read it twice, and something in his face changed so completely that Sorrel stopped breathing. Thomas is inside the apartment, Severin said. He turned the phone so she could see the photo. A small, dark-haired boy, wide-eyed, wrapped in a coat too big for him, gripping the hand of one of Severin's men in a stairwell. Alive, furious, safe. Milo's out. He hid exactly where you taught him. He bit Tomas when he pulled him out of the crawlspace, which Tomas wants you to know cost him a finger's worth of dignity. Sorrel Merrick put both hands over her face and made no sound at all, and Severin looked away because some grief and some relief are too private to witness, and he understood the difference now in a way he hadn't 3 hours ago. When she lowered her hands, her eyes were wet, and her voice was steady. Okay, she said. You want to be the one man who doesn't underestimate me. She wiped her face with the back of her scarred hand. Then take me somewhere safe, get my son under your roof, and I'll give you something no one on earth has had for 11 years, which is the ledger, Sorrel said. All of it. Everything Ambrose Vane ever buried. Her jaw set. You didn't just wake him up, Mr. Belandi. You made me decide to finally use the gun. They brought Milo to the safe house first, a plain gray townhouse in a plain gray street that Severin owned through 4 shell companies and Vane could not have found with a map and a year. Severin watched from the doorway as Sorrel crossed the room in 6 strides and dropped to her knees and gathered the boy against her. And the boy, furious, frightened, 9 buried his face in her neck, and finally, safely, began to cry, and Sorrel held the back of his head with one hand and looked over his shoulder at Severin, and mouthed two words. Thank you. Not for the gala. He understood that now. For this. He gave them the room. He went down to the kitchen, where Renzo had made coffee that was too strong on purpose, and he stood at the counter and did the coldest arithmetic of his life. You know what she is now, Renzo said. He wasn't asking. I know what she is. You know what having her means. Renzo turned a mug in his ruined hands. The vain ledger boss. Men have died just for saying they'd seen a page of it. She's got 11 years of it, indexed with a dead man's switch already built. You put that in front of the right people. He shook his head. Vane's finished. Not hurt. Finished. And whoever holds, the woman who holds the ledger, owns the single biggest piece of leverage in this city. I'm aware. So the play, Renzo said carefully. The smart play is you take a copy, you make a deal. You become the most powerful man on the river. And she and the kid vanish, with enough cash to be comfortable forever, somewhere Vane's ghost can't reach. He met Severin's eyes. That's the play that keeps your empire. That's the play the old you makes in his sleep. Upstairs, faintly, Severin could hear it. A low, aching sound. 4 strings under a woman's scarred hands. She'd asked for the cello. Of course she had. It was the only thing that had ever really been hers, and she was playing it for the boy the way another mother might sing, and the sound came down through the floors of the safe house and filled the cold kitchen, and Severin Belandi stood there and listened to it, and felt the last wall come down. No, he said. Renzo went still. I'm not making that play. Severin set down his coffee. She spent 11 years being the invisible one, being the leverage, being the useful thing men wanted to hold. I'm not going to be one more man who values her for the gun in her hand. He looked up at the ceiling toward the music. I broke Crispin Hale's hand tonight because I couldn't stand there and watch one more powerful man treat a person like she was nothing. And then I nearly turned around and did the exact same thing, just with better manners. No. He straightened his cuffs. An old gesture, a man squaring up. We don't use her ledger to become kings. We use everything I already have to make sure she never has to be useful to anyone again. Vane doesn't get bought off or outmaneuvered. Vane gets removed. And then that ledger goes in a fire, and Sorrel Merrick gets to be a woman who plays the cello and raises her boy, and never has to be leverage for the rest of her life. Renzo looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. The first smile Severin had seen on him all night. You understand what this costs, Renzo said. The Marbury's walk. The freight terminal's close to you. Vane's a war, not a favor, and half the men who owe you money owe it because they're scared of your reputation for never doing anything this stupid. He spread his hands. I'm mourning every deal you have is on fire. Then let it burn, Severin said. And he meant it the way he had never meant anything, and it felt, terrifyingly, like being awake for the first time in a decade. Get me everything we have on Ambrose Vane. Get me the men. And, Renzo. He picked his phone back up. Get me Delphine Marbury. I owe her one honest phone call before I set fire to her father's arrangement. He dialed. Upstairs the cello sang. And when Delphine answered, cold and clipped and already knowing, Severin Belandi said the sentence that ended the life he had spent 10 years building. The arrangement's dead, Delphine. Tell your father the terminals can find another partner. And tell whoever you report to above your father. A pause, because Severin had always suspected, and now he was sure, that I know Vane's been in your family's pocket for 3 years. I know it because I'm holding the person who wrote it all down. Stay out of my way this week, and you keep your name. That's the only mercy I have left in me tonight. The silence on the line was the sound of a bridge collapsing. Severin hung up and looked at the stairs and climbed them toward the music, toward the woman and the boy, toward the war. The point of no return was behind him. He had never in his life felt so free. For 3 days, the gray townhouse became the center of Severin Belandi's entire world, and the strangest thing about it, The thing he kept turning over at 4 in the morning was how quickly it stopped, feeling strange. Sorrel sat up at the kitchen table with a laptop, Renzo bought clean, and a legal pad, and the fierce, total concentration of a woman finally allowed to do the things she was best at. The ledger, it turned out, was not a book. It was a system, encrypted, distributed, hidden in plain sight, across a decade of dead drops and forgotten cloud accounts, and a safe deposit box in a city she wouldn't name. And only Sorrel could assemble it, key by key, from memory and muscle and the small worn habits of a mind that had been guarding it for 11 years. He always thought the danger was a person, she murmured on the second night, not looking up, her fingers moving. Someone he could find and remove. He never understood that the danger was a filing system. A thin smile. Men like Vane never respect the filing system. That's always how they fall. Severin learned things about her in those 3 days that no dossier could have told him. That she took her coffee with too much sugar and was embarrassed about it. That she'd taught herself 4 languages from library books during the years she was hiding, because a woman who might have to run again should be able to run anywhere. That she checked the locks in a specific order twice, every night, and that Milo checked them with her, the two of them moving through the little house in a ritual of safety they'd clearly performed 1,000 times, in 1,000 worse places. That she was funny, dry and quick and startling, once she trusted a room enough to be, and that the first time she made Renzo laugh, actually laugh, the big man looked as surprised as if a statue had done it. He learned the shape of her fear, too, which was not the shape he'd expected. She was not afraid of Vane, exactly. She had lived beside the fact of Vane for 11 years, the way people who live near a fault line stop flinching at the ground. What frightened her was smaller and more human dependence. On the second morning, he'd found her at 5 a.m. scrubbing the already clean kitchen, and when he'd asked why, she'd said, without turning around, because if I'm useful, you'll keep us. And if you keep us, Milo lives. That's the whole math, Severin. It's always been the whole math. And he'd stood in the doorway and understood that she had spent her entire adult life converting herself into a service so that the people who held her would have a reason not to let go, and that the cruelest thing he could do to a woman like that was let her keep believing love had to be earned by the hour. So he'd taken the sponge out of her hand and said, "The kitchen's clean. You're not staff here. Come, sit down." And she'd looked at him like he'd spoken a language she'd studied for years and never once heard said aloud. He learned that she hummed when she thought no one was listening, fragments of the same low, aching passages she'd played at the Gala, and that Milo had her exact way of going still when he was frightened. The whole-body stillness of a child taught too early that motion draws the eye. He learned that the boy slept with a flashlight and a packed bag under his bed, and that Sorrel had never once told him to stop, because she of all people knew you did not take a person's escape route until you were certain, all the way down, that they'd never need it again. Severin had spent a decade believing he understood leverage better than any man alive. In 3 days, a bookkeeper in his safe house taught him he'd never understood it at all, that the deepest leverage in the world was not a debt or a threat or a page of someone's buried sins. It was being the person another person could not afford to lose. Vane had spent 11 years hunting that leverage over Sorrel. Severin had it now simply by feeding her son breakfast, and it terrified him, because for the first time he held something he had no intention of ever using. And Milo. Severin had not expected Milo. The boy was suspicious of him for a full day. Sensibly, Severin thought, since Severin was a frightening stranger who had appeared in his life on the worst night of it. And then, on the second afternoon, Milo had wandered into the study where Severin was reading intelligence files and stood in the doorway and said, "You're the one who broke the man's hand." "I am." Was it what he said to her? Milo said, with the terrible directness of 9. Or the whole thing? Severin had set down the file. "The whole thing," he'd said. "But what he said to her is when I decided." Milo had considered this with great seriousness. Then he'd come in and sat down and started asking Severin about guns and cars, and whether it was true he owned a boat, and Severin, who had spent his life keeping everyone at the distance of a transaction, found himself, an hour later, still answering and not wanting the boy to leave. Something in his chest that had been clenched for as long as he could remember had, without his permission, begun to open. "He likes you," Sorrel said that night, in the kitchen, when Milo was finally asleep. "He doesn't like anyone. He's had to learn. People are dangerous. It took me 2 years to get him to sit with his back to a window." She wrapped both hands around her. "Too sweet coffee. You should know what that costs him. Trusting you." "I know exactly what it costs," Severin said. "It's the same thing it's costing me." She looked at him, then really looked, across the cheap kitchen table, under the bad light, and the professional distance they'd both been so carefully maintaining thinned to almost nothing. He was aware of the scar on her hand. The gray at her temple. She didn't die. The way she'd stopped, somewhere in the last 3 days, holding herself, like she took up too much room and started holding herself, like a woman with a stake in what happened next. "When this is over," she said slowly, "you're going to want something. Men who help always want something. I've never once in my life met an exception, and I stopped waiting for one a long time ago." She wasn't being cruel. She was warning him. Of herself. Of the shape of her expectations. "So tell me now, what do you want, Severin? The ledger? A cut of Vane's Rivers when he's gone?" "Me?" The word landed flat and offended. "Just tell me the price up front." "I can pay a price. It's owing a debt I don't understand that I can't survive." And Severin Belandi, who had built a life on transactions, who had never once given anything without a ledger entry, looked at this woman across the table and told her the truth. "When this is over," he said, "I want you to be able to sit with your back to a window. That's all. That's the whole price." He turned his own coffee in his hands. "I've spent my life making sure no one could ever take anything from me by making sure I loved nothing, and it worked. I have everything, and there's nothing in this world that could hurt me. And 3 days ago, I'd have told you that was strength." He shook his head. "It's the opposite. You spent 11 years hiding because you loved a boy enough to disappear. I spent 31 making sure I'd never have to. You were the strong one the whole time, Sorrel. I just had better tailoring." He met her eyes. "I don't want the ledger. I want to burn it. I don't want a cut of Vane's Rivers. I want him gone. So you never have to keep 2 sets of books again. And I don't want you as a price, a breath. I'd like, when this is finished, to earn you as a choice. But that's yours. That's the one thing in this whole war that isn't mine to take." The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere a pipe ticked. Sorrel Merrick sat across from him with her scarred hands around a cheap mug, and her eyes bright, and for a long moment she didn't say anything at all. Then she reached across the table, and very deliberately turned her chair so that her back was to the window. "There," she said, and her voice only shook a little. "I'm practicing." Renzo came through the door before Severin could answer, phone in hand, and the look on his face changed the temperature of the room. "Vane found the safe deposit box," he said, "the one in the city she wouldn't name. He got there an hour ago, a beat. It's empty, boss. She'd already moved it. But he knows now, knows for certain the woman's alive and the ledger's real and someone's helping her. And he knows one more thing." Renzo's jaw worked. "He found out about the boy. There's no father on record, but a man that thorough doesn't need a record. He knows Milo exists. And he just put a number on him, a bounty, to anyone who brings the kid in alive." He looked at Sorrel. "He's not coming for you anymore. He's coming for your son tonight." Sorrel Merrick stood up so fast her chair fell over, and Severin Belandi felt the last cold thing inside him turn. Finally, all the way to fire. Ambrose Vane liked to do his real business from a glass office on the top floor of a building he'd named after his mother. 40 stories above the river he'd bled dry, Because he believed, the way all men like him eventually came to believe, that height was the same thing as safety. Severin let him keep believing it until 3 a.m. The bounty on Milo had changed the math, and everyone in the safe house knew it. A man like Vane, once he'd put a number on a child, did not unput it. The number would sit out in the world like bait in water, and every desperate freelancer and bought cop and hungry rival would keep pulling threads until one of them found the gray townhouse. Sorrel had understood it before Severin finished the sentence. "We don't have a week," she'd said. "We don't have 3 days. The moment he priced my son, the clock stopped being mine." She'd looked at the map she'd built on the kitchen table, at 11 years of a man's secrets rendered into ingress points and shift rotations. "So we don't wait for a better night. There isn't one. We go tonight, while he still thinks he's hunting and doesn't know he's already been caught." Severin had watched her say it. This woman who 3 days ago had made herself smaller to survive a party, and understood that the invisibility had never been who she was. It had been armor, and she had just taken it off, on purpose, in his kitchen, and picked up the gun she'd refused to fire for 11 years, because they had finally threatened the one thing she'd built the whole disappearance to protect. The plan was Sorrel's as much as his. She knew Vane's habits, his people, the 3 men he actually trusted and the 40 he didn't. She knew which private elevator bypassed the lobby, and which guard could be bought and which couldn't, and would therefore need to be handled another way. She built the approach on the kitchen table with the same flat, brilliant focus she'd brought to the ledger, and Severin watched her do it and thought, 11 years. He hunted a bookkeeper for 11 years, and never once understood that the bookkeeper was the most dangerous person he'd ever met. Milo stayed at the safe house, with Renzo's 2 best men, and a door that could stop a truck. Sorrel had crouched in front of him before they left and made him repeat the drill: hide, don't answer, wait for the word, and Milo had said the word back to her, solemn and scared, and then he'd look past his mother at Severin and said, "Bring her back." And Severin had said, "I will." And it was the first promise in a decade he had made without calculating the odds. There had been an argument, before they left, about whether she came at all. "You stay with Milo," Severin had said, and meant it, because the thought of her in that building put a cold hand around his throat. "I have the ledger's map. I have your notes. I don't need you on the floor." "You need me on the floor precisely because you think you don't," Sorrel had answered, calm as a closed ledger. "You have my map. You don't have my instinct. If a code's been changed, if a guard's been swapped, if Vane's done one single thing differently in the last 11 years, you won't know until it's already gone wrong. And I will, because I spent 4 years learning the exact rhythm of how that man protects himself. You want the one person alive who can read Ambrose Vane in real time. That's me. It was always me." She'd held his eyes. "And I have earned the right to be in the room when it ends. Don't take that from me to keep me safe. I've had enough men decide what I'm allowed to survive." He hadn't had an answer to that. There wasn't one. So he'd nodded and handed her a vest, and she'd put it on over the black button-down, like she'd done it before, because of course she had. They took Vane's building floor by floor, quiet as rising water. Severin's men moved the way Sorrel's blueprint told them to. Through the blind spots, past the bot guard, up the private elevator whose code she'd pulled from 11-year-old memory and prayed hadn't changed. Twice she stopped them with a raised hand at things the map didn't show. A new camera on the service landing, a guard rotation shifted by 20 minutes, and rerouted them in a whisper, and each time Severin watched his men adjust to a woman none of them had met a week ago as though she'd commanded them for years. She had the thing you could not teach. She was never the loudest person in a crisis, and she was always, quietly, the most right. It hadn't changed. The elevator code, the blind spots, the arrogance. Vane was arrogant about the things that had always worked. That, in the end, was the whole shape of him. They came out on the 40th floor into a dark glass office, with the whole grieving city spread out below it, and Ambrose Vane was standing at the window with a drink in his hand, and he did not turn around because he had heard the elevator and assumed it was his own people bringing him good news. "Tell me you have the boy," he said to the glass. "No one has the boy," Severin said. "No one is ever going to have the boy." Ambrose Vane turned around. He was older than his photographs, thinner, with the papery elegance of a man who had spent his whole life being feared and had come to mistake it for being loved. His eyes moved over Severin, over the men behind him, and then, as the last figure stepped out of the elevator's shadow into the city light, over Sorrel Merrick, and Severin watched 11 years fall on the man all at once, watched him understand, watched the drink stop halfway to his mouth. "You," Thane breathed. "Me," Sorrel agreed. "You're dead. I spent—" He stopped, recalibrated the way survivors do, his face smoothed. "You've been dead for 11 years. Do you know what it cost me, wondering? Do you know how much money I spent on a ghost?" And then, unbelievably, he laughed. A dry, delighted, poisonous sound. "Oh, this is good. You've been under a rock this whole time, and now you've crawled out of it? For?" His eyes cut to Severin. "For him. You threw away the only thing keeping you alive, your invisibility. For a gangster in a nice suit who broke a boy's toy at a party," he shook his head, pitying. "I'd have left you alone forever, you stupid woman. You were safe. All you had to do was stay unseen." "I know," Sorrel said quietly. "That's what I couldn't live with anymore." And she set a slim black drive down on Ambrose Vane's desk, and the sound it made against the glass was very small, and it was the loudest thing in the room. "That's a copy," she said. "One of many. The others went out 40 minutes ago. Federal, Foreign, the two papers that hate you most, and a fifth place you'll never guess and can never buy. The Dead Man Switch you spent 11 years. Afraid of I already threw it, Ambrose. I threw it myself. From your own lobby while we were riding up in your elevator, it's done. By the time the sun comes up, everything you buried, every number, every name, every rounding error that used to be a person is in the hands of people you cannot reach, cannot frighten, and cannot pay." She tilted her head, and there was no cruelty in it, only a terrible final calm. "You spent 11 years hunting the gun. You never once realized I'd already loaded it. Tonight was just me coming to watch you find out it was pointed at you the whole time." Ambrose Vane's face came apart. He lunged, not at her, at the drive, as if grabbing the copy could unmake the truth, and Severin's men moved, and Vane's own arrogance had left him with only 2 men on this floor, because he'd never believed anyone could get this high, and it was over almost before it began. It was not a slaughter. Severin had promised her it wouldn't be, in front of the boy, and he kept his promises now. Vane's men were disarmed and put on the floor. Vane himself was pressed into his own expensive chair, breathing hard, staring at the drive, at the ruin, at the 11 years of certainty, dissolving in real time. "You're going to prison," Severin told him almost gently. "Not because I killed you. Killing you would have made you a story. A martyr, a mystery, a warning. No. You're going to sit in a cell and watch every empire you built get taken apart in the papers by name, by a bookkeeper you called furniture, and you're going to have decades to think about the fact that the woman you couldn't find was raising her child 3 miles from your office the whole time, playing cello for tips, waiting to decide you weren't worth burning her son's safety over." He leaned down. "She finally decided you were. That's the last thing you get to know." He straightened, nodded to Renzo. The calls were already going out, the ones Sorrel's ledger had made possible, to the exact people who had waited 11 years for exactly this. At the elevator, Sorrel stopped and looked back, once at Ambrose Vane, small now in his glass tower, 40 stories up and utterly without safety. "You were right about one thing," she said. "It did cost me my invisibility." The doors began to close. Turns out, I didn't need it anymore. By the time the sun came up over the river, Ambrose Vane's name was on every screen in the city, And it was not on any of them in a way he would have chosen. It took months, in the end, the way these things do. The ledger did what Sorrel had built it to do. It did not explode, it dismantled, one indictment at a time, one frozen account at a time, methodical and unstoppable. The revenge of a woman who understood that the most permanent destruction is administrative. Vane's rivers went to other hands, his investments scattered. Crispin Hale, whose broken hand had started all of it, gave testimony in exchange for a lighter sentence and spent the rest of his life as the punchline he tried so hard never to be. And Severin Belandi's empire, the deals, the terminals, the careful decade of leverage, burned exactly the way Renzo had promised it would. Severin let it, he found he did not miss it. A man who has finally learned the difference between having everything and having anything worth losing does not grieve the loss of the first when he's just found the second. He kept the safe house. It was too plain and too gray, and he'd never owned anything he loved more. The change in Milo was the thing Severin marked time by. In the first weeks, the boy still flinched at doorbells, still checked the locks, and still kept the light and the bag close. Severin never pushed him to give them up. He understood, now that you do not strip a frightened person of the exits they've learned to sleep beside. Instead, he did something quieter. He taught Milo how the locks worked, really worked. The mechanism, the pins, the reason a good deadbolt holds, until the boy understood the door, not as a thing that might fail him, but as a thing he commanded. He taught him the safe house had 4 ways out, and walked him to each one, not so Milo would run, but so he'd know he could, and knowing he could was the thing that finally let him stay. One night, a month in, Severin passed the boy's room and saw the flashlight on the nightstand instead of under the pillow, and the bag gone from beneath the bed, folded away in the closet, and he stood in the dark hallway of a house he'd bought to hide people in and had to put a hand against the wall. He learned, too, that raising a child was nothing like running an empire, and everything like it. The same attention to the small tell that meant something larger was wrong. The same patience, the same understanding that trust was built in increments and destroyed in an instant. He was good at it, to his own astonishment. He had thought the cold in him ran all the way down. It turned out, the cold had only ever been a wall, and behind the wall was a man who wanted, more than he had ever wanted, power, to be the reason a 9-year-old slept with the light on the nightstand instead of under the pillow. There was one conversation, somewhere in those months, that mattered more than all the indictments. It happened on an ordinary evening, after Milo was asleep, when Sorrel set down her tea and said without preamble, "I have to tell you something I've never told anyone, not even him." And she told him what she'd told him once already, in the dark of a moving car, and then buried again under a safer story, that Milo was not her sister's son, that there had never been a sister, that the boy asleep upstairs was hers born in hiding, raised under a lie, built to keep him off every record a man like Vane could pull. "I kept the story so long I almost believed it," she said, and her voice broke on it at last. 11 years of it. "He's mine, Severin. He's always been mine. I just couldn't afford for anyone to know how much I had to lose." And Severin had taken her scarred hand and said the only thing that fit, which was, "Then we make sure he never has to be a secret again." And it was, he understood, the truest vow he'd ever made, truer than any he'd have said at an altar to Delphine Marbury. The night the last of it settled, the night the final account froze, and the war was at long last simply over, Severin came home to find Milo asleep on the couch with a book on his chest, and Sorrel in the kitchen, and the cello leaning in the corner where it lived now, and the whole small house warm with the ordinary, staggering safety of people who no longer had to run. "He waited up for you," Sorrel said, "as long as he could." She was making tea. Her back was to the window. She did that on purpose now, every day, a private ceremony, and every day it got a little less like practice, and a little more like peace. He wants you to teach him to drive. He's 9. I told him ask again in 7 years. I could start him on the boat, Severin offered. Water's more forgiving. She laughed, the real one, the dry, quick, startling one, and Severin thought, as he had thought 100 times in the last months, that he would burn 100 empires to keep being the man she laughed at like that. She looked at him across the kitchen, where the whole war had been planned and won, and then she said, carefully, the way she said things that mattered, "You told me you didn't want me as a price, that you wanted to earn me as a choice." Her scarred hand rested flat on the counter. "I've been thinking about that for 6 months. About how I've spent my whole life either being taken or being useful and never once being chosen, and how the only man who ever refused to take me is the one who broke a rich boy's hand across a ballroom because he couldn't stand to watch me be made small." Her eyes were bright. "You asked for the one thing in the whole war that wasn't yours to take." "I did. Then I'm giving it to you," Sarl Merrick said. "The choice. It's yes." Her voice shook, and she let it, because she didn't have to be small anymore, didn't have to be invisible, didn't have to be anything but exactly, fully, dangerously herself. It was, yes. The night you turned your chair toward the window with me, I just needed to be sure it was a choice and not a debt. It's a choice, Severin. You're my choice. Severin Belandi, who had spent 31 years making certain he loved nothing so that nothing could ever be taken from him, crossed the kitchen and took her scarred hand in both of his, and understood at last that he'd had it exactly backwards his entire life. The strength was never in having nothing to lose. The strength was in, finally, having everything. "You should know," he murmured against her temple. "I fired the man who taught me that love was a weakness. Took me 31 years, but I finally let him go." "Good," she whispered. "He was terrible at his job." On the couch, Milo slept the sleep of a boy who has forgotten how to be afraid, his book rising and falling on his chest. In a warm gray house with the doors locked in the right order, and the woman who saved him and the man who chose them, both standing in the kitchen at last unhurried, with their backs to the window and nothing left in the world to run from. And that is what happens when a powerful man learns that the person everyone overlooks was the strongest one in the room the entire time. If this story moved you, if you felt Severin's cold walls come down the moment he decided Sorrel Merrick would never be made small, again, do me one favor. Somewhere in your life there's an overlooked person, the quiet one in the corner, the one who takes up space and apologizes for it, the one everybody looks past. Go see them today. Because the whole point of this story is that the people the world refuses to look at are so often the strongest, bravest, most extraordinary people in the entire room. If you loved this dark redemptive journey, the mockery, the reckoning, the slow thaw of a frozen man, smash that like button, subscribe for more grounded stories, where the overlooked ones hold all the power, and tell me down in the comments, what was the exact moment you knew Severin had fallen for her? Was it the broken glass, the chair turned toward the window, or the promise he made to a 9-year-old boy? I read every comment. I'll see you in the next one.